You're about to meet Mother Angela Gillespie. Here is some background to her story. America's population in 1800 was 5 million. This grew to 76 million in 1900. During those years, Western civilization spread from sea to sea. Canals and telegraph systems were built, a coast-to-coast railway system was laid down, and a civil war was fought that ended slavery and preserved our national unity at a cost of over 600,000 lives. Our ancestors established our governmental structures and rules of law. They built the infrastructures for many of today's cities and towns. This was a time when there was almost no cure for illness, when 40% of children died before the age of 5, and when the average life expectancy was only 40 years of age. In the midst of this, Christian and civic organizations worked to improve the lives of the needy. Our heroine, Mother Angela, was a Catholic who was passionate in her faith, which guided her through life. This story illustrates how her faith helped her address many of the challenging issues in the 1800s.
On behalf of St. Mary's Parish here in Lancaster, Ohio, I'm Father Jim Walter, and I'm privileged to introduce to you Mother Angela. Mother Angela Gillespie is an educator as well as a Civil War hero. She was a parishioner here at St. Mary's in Lancaster from 1838 until 1853. She was active in the parish and started our parish school here in 1847 with the support of the resident pastor, Father Joshua Young. Her maternal grandparents are buried locally at St. Mary's Cemetery. General Ulysses S. Grant said of her, "Mother Angela is a woman of rare charm, unusual ability, and exceptional executive talents." The success of St. Mary's Academy in South Bend, Indiana, and the early growth there of the Sisters of the Holy Cross are largely attributable to Mother Angela, a woman who shepherded multiple new ventures for the sisters.
Thank you, Father Walter, and thank you for being here and being interested in my story. Shall we pray? Father God, you have created each one of us to do you some definite service. You have committed some work to me which you have not committed to another. I have a mission. I may never know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. I'm a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. You have not created me for naught. I shall do good. I shall do your work. Amen. Well, the opportunity to pray and worship openly is one of those innate freedoms that brought many immigrants, including some of my ancestors, and maybe some of yours, to this country. These immigrants, these pioneers, instilled in their children a deep devotion to their faith. The Catholic community in Lancaster grew slowly but steadily. Jacob Ditto and Hugh Boyle were among the earliest Catholic settlers. The first Mass was celebrated by Father Fenwick in 1817 at the home of Patrick Garrity the first Catholic church, built in 1820, was a simple log cabin served only by a missionary priest. The second church, built in 1840 with Father Nicholas Young as its resident pastor. The third church, which you know today as the Basilica of St. Mary of the Assumption, began construction in 1859 and was completed in 1864. Well, neither my parents nor I were born in Lancaster. My mother, Mary Madeline Myers, came from Martinsburg, Virginia, as an infant. My father, John Purcell Gillespie, was born on the family farm, Indian Hill, outside of Brownsville, Pennsylvania. So, how did we make that Lancaster connection? Well, 3 of my father's aunts married Lancaster men. Eleanor Gillespie married Hugh Boyle. Susan Gillespie married Philemon Beecher, and Elizabeth Gillespie married William Irwin. My father came to Lancaster to visit his aunts, met my mother, and the rest, as they always say, is history. My mother was not Catholic at the time, but that was not a problem. They were married by Father Fenwick in 1821 and moved to Indian Hill. My grandfather had gifted my parents half of a double house there, and into the other half moved my father's sister and her husband, Ephraim Blaine. Well, my parents' first child, christened Maria Eliza Gillespie, died in infancy. My mother was sorely distraught, and in her despair, she looked to my father and saw how his Catholic faith supported him in his distress. She began to inquire more about the Catholic faith and did convert. And my mother truly embraced the Catholic faith for the rest of her life. Well, I was born in February of 1824 and christened Eliza Maria Gillespie. My godfather was Thomas Ewing. Well, growing up on Indian Hill, we had farmland, and I would love to walk that land with my father, and we would talk about just everything. Family legend has it that I taught myself to read at the age of 4. Well, I was so fortunate that my father believed in education for women, and I started in a private school in Brownsville when I was 5. My parents taught me their faith by the lives they lived, including works of charity. Well, I was 4 when my sister Mary Rebecca was born, and 7 when Neil was born. Well, we played with our Blaine cousins who lived right beside us. I was the leader of our merry band because I was the oldest. It was also said I was a bit precocious and at times a true daredevil. My cousin, Jimmy Blaine, would run for president in 1884 against Grover Cleveland. Well, in the late 1835, my grandfather's businesses began to fail, and my father wanted to help out, so on a cold January day, he went out to help collect the rents. He caught a cold that turned into pneumonia, and my father died in January of 1836. I cared for my siblings while my mother was again in deep mourning. But then my mother became concerned about my lack of religious preparation for my first communion. So while Mother stayed in Brownsville to care for my grandparents and siblings, I was sent to school in Somerset, Ohio, to a school run by the Dominican nuns. It was a long coach ride to Somerset, all by myself. My only comfort in going was that my cousin, Ellen Ewing, who was only 8 months younger than I, was already there. Ellen and I developed a friendship there that would last us a lifetime. Well, I was quizzed and found well prepared to enter the First Communion class. We received intense religious instruction, along with classes in reading, writing, and geography. Our faith deepened during our time in Somerset, and we learned the value of good works. Whenever I did grow homesick, I would fly to the chapel in prayer. When Grandfather Gillespie died in 1838, my mother decided it was time to return to Lancaster. We moved into a small cottage behind the Ewings, and I had more cousins to play with. I homeschooled Neil and Mary Rebecca, but one of my passions developed while in Lancaster. I loved horseback riding and racing, and I would just challenge anybody to a race. While I liked to win, I did not always. Another family event were those marvelous picnics that we used to have at the foot of Mount Pleasant. Well, in 1840, my mother married William Phelan, a well-to-do local businessman, and he moved our whole family out to Mount Eagle, a large farm on the Baltimore Pike. Well, Ellen had started school at the Georgetown Academy with the Sisters of Visitation in 1837, and by 1840, I wished to attend. And I talked to Mother, and I said, I desire more of a traditional education, even though the library at Mount Eagle was filled with books. The money for my tuition came from Grandmother Gillespie. Well, Ellen and I together, again, we made frequent trips into Washington City. We loved to attend opera and the art galleries, but we also liked to attend Congress and listen to the senatorial debates. We were most often the guest of Thomas Ewing at formal dinners, parties, and my second love, dancing. My favorite teacher at the Georgetown Academy was Sister Stanislaus Jones, daughter of naval hero Commander John Paul Jones. She challenged me to an even deeper mental and spiritual outlook. While there, I also defied local custom and taught Black children to read and write. I graduated in June 1842 at the age of 18 and returned to Lancaster. Those days were spent riding the fields with Mr. Phelan at Mount Eagle, and I helped him with the farm accounts, and I also helped him with the management of the farm. I helped my mother in the kitchen, and Mother and I were both extremely active in parish work. But my favorite duty was to prepare the house for visiting priests, because that meant then we could have Mass at home. Well, in 1845, Father Young and I helped Mother with an educational quandary about where to send Neil and Mary Rebecca for further education. Mary Rebecca finally chose St. Xavier's in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. During this time away, she thought briefly about entering the religious life. And I thought then that that path might be okay for her, but neither the religious life nor married life held much allure for me. Ellen Ewing might also have considered the religious life if it were not for her interest in William Tecumseh Sherman. Well, as for Neil, Mother wanted a Catholic college far enough away from Lancaster to eliminate his frequent trips home. While waiting to see Father Young about this one afternoon, she found a Cincinnati Catholic Telegraph advertisement for a boys' school at Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, and the decision was made. Well, the fortunate solution of a Catholic education for Neil and Mary Rebecca increased Father Young's desire to have a local parish school, but with his parish duties, he had no time. So in the summer of 1847, he came out to Mount Eagle and asked if I would volunteer my services. Well, since I had had the benefit of a Catholic education, I wanted others to have those same opportunities. Father Young proposed that we use the church basement. It would have heat and light and be furnished with desks and benches. I agreed to supply the textbooks, knowing that I would ask my friends for donations. I also designed the course of study. Enrollment grew rapidly, and we had to engage another teacher before the end of our first school year. Well, the summer of 1848 found us preparing Mary Rebecca's trousseau. She had long given up the idea of religious life, and she was going to marry Philemon Beecher Ewing, Ellen's oldest brother. During the cholera outbreak in Lancaster in 1849, I helped Uncle John Bigelow care for the deserted and the dying. I gained medical expertise from him as we nursed, soothed, and cared for the afflicted. While the outbreak only lasted several weeks, my time with Uncle Bigelow would serve me well in the years to come. When Neil graduated from Notre Dame in 1849, he helped me teach the boys at St. Mary's for that school year. Well, he and I would walk home every day after school and share our ideas for the future and our faith. In September 1850, Neil returned to Notre Dame to teach mathematics and to begin his studies in the priesthood of the Order of the Holy Cross. He wrote to me that should I ever desire to enter the religious life, Notre Dame would be a good place to come. He said the Sisters of the Holy Cross serve God by teaching young ladies, caring for the orphans, and tending to the sick. Well, with Mary Rebecca married, and now Ellen married and gone to St. Louis, and Neil gone to seminary, I felt I needed a change. St. Mary's School was well established, and I had trained its teachers, and my other parish obligations seemed well in hand. I was craving a broader field of accomplishment. I also wanted to help with Brother Neil's seminary expenses. I was offered a teaching contract at St. Mary's Academy in St. Mary's City, Maryland, earning $300 a year plus board. Well, in addition to teaching, I also accompanied Father Lilly on sick calls. Thanks to Uncle Bigelow, I could dress a wound and diagnose some illnesses. While I was once offered a proposal of marriage, I told my mother, I have not yet met the man I could promise to love, honor, and obey. Well, week-long house parties were very common in the area, and the distance between houses was great and travel was not easy. I was attending the grand ball at a friend's house, and as Belle was setting out my dress, I noticed that she seemed extremely sad, and I said, Belle, is there a problem? And she said, yes, my mother is very sick and home alone in our cabin. And I told her, I said, you are dismissed from any service for me for the rest of the evening. You need to go home and be with your mother. And before she left, I said, Belle, are you Catholic? And she said, yes, both my mother and I are. And I said, if you will wait for me, I will go down and dance the obligatory first dance on my dance card. And then you and I will go and see your mother. I met her in the kitchen, and we walked down to the slave quarters. It had been raining, and the walk was atrocious. When we approached the cabin, I saw that it was dark. We walked in. I noticed the solitary figure on the bed. While Belle stoked the fire, I went over to see her mother, and I realized that she was dying. I told Belle she needed to bring some friends in, and she also needed to go get the priest. While she was gone, I sat with her mother, and we prayed and said a good act of contrition, and her mother died. And it was in that evening that I was convinced that God had called me to serve him alone. I resigned my teaching position at the end of term and returned home to Lancaster. At the age of 29, I planned to enter the Sister of Mercy Convent in Chicago. I wanted to live in obscurity where no one would know my family background. Well, Mother and I stopped to say goodbye to Neil at Notre Dame, and it was there that I first met Father Soren, the founder of Notre Dame. And he boldly proclaimed to me, "Miss Gillespie, you are the one I have been praying for, that God would give me a helpmate in the task of forming a sisterhood in the wilderness." But both Father Soren and Neil encouraged me to visit the Sisters of the Holy Cross, about 6 miles away in Bertrand. I was so impressed with their way of life, with their poverty and the simplicity of the nuns there, that I requested time for a retreat. And after prayer and quiet reflection, I then realized that only with the Sisters of the Holy Cross would I find peace in my life's work. I took the veil and the name Sister Mary of St. Angela. St. Angela, who had lived in the 1400s, had devoted her life to the teaching and training of young girls. I was sent to France for my novitiate. While there, I learned sign language and the French language. Father Soren had come over to the ceremony in France when I took my final vows, and on the long voyage home, we had many conversations concerning Catholic education in America. Besides the core curricula, where I had already inserted science and advanced mathematics, I wanted to introduce foreign languages, drawing, painting, music, and art, and of course, I wanted good facilities and good teachers. I wanted to put St. Mary's Academy on par with the Eastern schools. I planned to have a secondary school as well as an elementary school for girls. The future mothers of the faithful should be soundly instructed. St. Angela was often heard to say that disorder in society is a result of disorder in the home. My desire was to see all Catholic youth well educated. St. Mary's Academy would become my model for all future establishments of learning. Well, quickly, I realized that we were working with substandard textbooks. So this led me to create a series of readers, the Metropolitan readers, and later the Excelsior readers. They were designed for elementary, secondary, and college level students. I wrote and edited these readers with Neil's help, solicited contributions for written materials, and arranged for the publishing and distribution of these letters. To that effort, I wrote a letter to Mr. Erastus Bronson, a recent convert to Catholicism, noted editor, orator, and mid-19th century apologist. And I said, "Highly honored sir, the fact that we are both deeply interested in one great question, Catholic education, makes me feel no diffidence in addressing you, though a total stranger, and asking your assistance in a work in which I am engaged at present. As the provincial superior of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, an order devoted exclusively to education, I have long felt the want in our schools of a good series of readers, and during the last year I have spent much time compiling a series to meet the needs of the age. The Protestants have a good series, Hilliard's, and I am planning for a Catholic set. For the primary books, I have drawn chiefly from Faber's Tales of the Angels and from Hans Christian Andersen. For the advanced readers, I want to give students an idea of what is literature. Observation has convinced me that 3/5 of boys and girls whose education is finished indulge in no other form of reading than yellow-backed literature, simply because they have not been taught to cultivate a literary taste in school. If I can obtain your help in suggesting authors and revising proof sheets, that would be most helpful. My residence is at St. Mary's near Notre Dame in Indiana, where we have a flourishing academy for young ladies on a beautiful farm of 800 acres. Also, a school for deaf mutes and an industrial school for girls. Thank you for your kind attention. Well, in 1855, Father Soren decided it was time to relocate St. Mary's from Bertrand, Michigan, to South Bend, about a mile away from the Notre Dame campus. Some buildings he literally dismantled, moved, and reassembled because of our lack of funds. The Order of the Holy Cross was not quite 20 years old, founded in 1837 by Father Moreau, and had not yet amassed much property or wealth. Well, to this end, Mother talked to Mr. Phelan on several occasions about making a gift to Notre Dame. With a son and a daughter there in religious life, she did not want us to suffer for lack of finances. Well, Mr. Phelan had grown lax in his Catholic faith while pursuing multiple business endeavors, but did, in 1855, deed all his property, including Mount Eagle, and his entire fortune to Notre Dame, in exchange for a small yearly stipend for himself and my mother and housing on the campus. His property and assets amounted to almost $90,000. Mr. Phelan was delighted to be at South Bend, where his Catholic faith was renewed, and he and I made great plans for the gardens. But he only lived another year and is buried there. In his honor, I completed the gardens as we had planned. Well, as the fame and stature of St. Mary's Academy grew and was being recognized, we were asked to establish schools in other areas. In many cases, as the years passed, we were gifted with buildings or land, but given no monies to furnish or staff them. I often reached out to friends and strangers to help. Fundraising and friend-raising became my second career. We established schools in Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, Morris, Illinois. St. Mary's became the first legally authorized Catholic college for women in the United States. Well, while we were busy organizing schools, the country was falling apart. By the fall of 1861, General Ulysses S. Grant realized that this war would not be brief and it would create many casualties. The Army had been recruiting nurses at the beginning of the war. Their only requirements was that women had to be over 30 years of age and unattractive. Well, some slightly injured soldiers also served as nurses. Grant sent a request through Governor Morton to Father Soren for sisters to volunteer as nurses. I was 37 years old when I left with 6 other sisters. We reported to General Grant in Cairo, Illinois, and accepted his request to immediately go to Paducah, Kentucky, to serve 3 regimental hospitals. Well, at first, the surgeons were unwilling to have sisters in the wards. Not that it was the nuns they objected to, but the subpar work of previous nurses. Opposition vanished quickly as I dispensed each nurse to her post with explicit instructions. The floors were to be scrubbed clean of blood. Bed linen was to be changed. The sick were to be bathed. And we were going to serve appetizing meals. I took charge at the kitchen and requested eggs, milk, and chicken, and prepared the meals myself. We were next sent to Louisville, Kentucky, and our third assignment was at Mound City, Illinois. At that point, I had to send to South Bend for more sisters to come. We were given a row of unfinished warehouses. They brought 600 wounded to this unfurnished facility with the expectation of 1,000 more soldiers to follow. The wounded lay on the bare floors with only their knapsacks for pillows and some rough blankets for covering. I was scrubbing the floors when the sisters arrived. We had a house full of sick soldiers, but no hospital supplies and little food. Helen Summer and I ransacked the neighborhood for food and furniture. We begged for food and supplies from friends and strangers. To this end, I wrote a letter to a former student, Ann Harmon of Peoria, Illinois. Can you not speak to the Ladies' Relief Association in Peoria and have them send us a large supply of clothing, such as shirts, drawers, socks, and slippers, canned fruits and jellies? We stand greatly in need of all such articles for the comfort of the poor suffering soldiers. Well, Civil War nurse and sanitation supervisor Mary Livermore said of our efforts, "Out of little, the Sisters of the Holy Cross fashioned the best military hospital in the United States." And she also said that wherever the Holy Cross sisters were sent, they were able to bring order, comfort, cleanliness, and above all, good nursing. When generals failed to secure the needed aid for the sick and wounded, I made several trips to Washington, and I used my family's connections to garner the supplies needed. We treated all wounded soldiers who came through our doors, no matter the color of their uniform. At times, we had to separate the wounded soldiers because they continued to want to kill each other. Other assignments we took on included hospitals in Memphis and Louisville. In all, with about 80 sisters, we were responsible for the management and staffing of 8 military hospitals and supplied some nursing staff on the Red Rover, the Navy's first military hospital ship. Other orders of Catholic sisterhood served in the war effort. Well, while our sisters were engaged in the war effort, we also managed to keep St. Mary's open, and the enrollment there continued to grow. I went home to South Bend to oversee the construction of Bertrand Hall, a 4-story building plus basement. Later constructs included the Bertrand Annex and Lord's Hall. We now had 220 students, many girls from the South, whose parents had sent them north for a good education and for their safety. Well, the Civil War efforts took a tremendous toll on my health. I wore myself out nursing the legion of casualties, intervening in an attempted assassination of a Confederate officer by Union troops, and contending with my superiors in France, who did not approve of the role our religious order was playing in the war. Well, differences in culture and needs between the American sisters and those in Europe made it evident it was time to ask for a separation from the Mother House. I made several trips to Europe to request this and to petition for the establishment of the American Sisters of the Holy Cross. I presented a new constitution, but approval and ratification took years. Finally, this request was fully granted the year after my death. Well, after the war, Father Soren decided to publish a new magazine, the Ave Maria, dedicated to the love and understanding of the Blessed Mary, Mother of our dear Lord. It was scoffed at by many. Well, where would we find the Catholic writers? Where would we find the Catholic readers? Well, I thought it was a fine idea, and I was willing to serve as editor and overseer until Neil returned from Europe, when he became the editor of this publication. Well, the continuing turmoil of relations with the Mother House in France, the increasing demand for our sisters to form new academies, orphanages, and training schools, the loss of sisters due to poor health and death, the church politic, the strained relations between the Mother House in France under founder Father Moreau and the provincial house at Notre Dame under Father Soren had been taking a toll on my mental as well as physical health. In 1873, a request came from Austin, Texas. Mrs. Mary Doyle had left an extensive estate to be used to create an institution of Catholic education. I saw a bonus to that particular site in that the climate would lend itself to a healthy restorative location for our invalid sisters in that mild, dry atmosphere of Texas. But before I committed to the request, and upon General Sherman's recommendation, I was told I should visit the site. Well, that arduous journey included a 500-mile train ride to Cairo, 5 days on a steamer down the Mississippi to New Orleans, a ferry to Algiers, another train ride. Then we sailed up the Gulf of Mexico to Galveston and up Galveston Bay to Houston, and from there a train from Houston to Austin. While I committed to the Texas needs, I could not fully commit to the project until I had the needed sisters. As I left to return home, I told them they would be in my prayers until we could move this academy forward. 1874 was a very trying one for me. My brother Neil died at age 42. My brother Neil, who was the first graduate of Notre Dame, who was ordained a priest of the Holy Cross in 1856, who was president of St. Mary's of the Lake in Chicago, vice president of Notre Dame, spent 3 years teaching in France, was the editor of the Ave Maria. He founded the student newspaper, The Scholastic, but most of all, he was my confidant and my friend. Well, as generous as vocations had been in the United States, was no longer enough to supply the never-ending request for sisters for new institutions. With trips to Ireland, France, and Germany, I never seemed to weary while on travels to recruit for the Lord. By April of 1874, our recruitment abroad had paid off, and we began to plan anew for the Austin Foundation. At the end of the first year, we had 80 students, and that institution led to another academy in Marshall, Texas. By March of 1875, we had opened St. Catherine Normal Institute, a teacher training school in Baltimore, Maryland. It was to be the nursery of religious vocation, for there we trained our sisters to be holy, religious, and educated to a high degree. We taught our sisters how to be holy educators. In April of 1875, Father Soren received yet another request to open a school in Salt Lake City, Utah, and a hospital for minors in Ogden, Utah. Woodland, California, where we established Holy Rosary Academy. With this final foundation, I realized a long-cherished dream. We had completed a geographic sign of the cross across the United States, from Michigan to Texas, from Washington, D.C. to California. I visited all these academies under our guidance and direction. I arbitrated disputes and tried to keep the sisters happy while also trying to instill in our students a lifetime love of learning. I felt the essence of all instructions should lead to a strengthening of our faith. Well, after a stop in California in 1886, I traveled straight to Baltimore, Maryland for a celebratory service where my good friend, Archbishop Gibbons, was installed as cardinal in the old Baltimore Cathedral. On my way home to Notre Dame, I had to make a stop in Columbus, Ohio. A hospital project begun there by Dr. W.B. Hawks was foundering. The project had started in 1884 when Dr. Hawks donated property and $11,000 for a charity hospital, but he died a year later. My cousin, Mr. Henry Miller, had promised financial support to the institution, provided that I would organize it and supply sisters for the nursing staff. While the hospital was barely finished when we arrived, it already had 2 patients. So I needed to write to the Mother House Got to Columbus with Sister Rufina on Monday. Found 2 very sick patients here with a day nurse who left as soon as we came. Sister Rufina took care of the patients while I did the cooking and what I could to fix up the house. With Mr. and Mrs. Miller's help, we got along nicely. I'll try to leave here by the 11th. I am sure they are growing impatient in Woodland. Bishop Watterson is in Pittsburgh. His mother is at the point of death. Please excuse penciling, no pen or ink here. I sent a briefer note on Sunday, July the 18th. I cannot leave today. 5 surgical cases in the house, 5 more expected tomorrow. It would be cruelty to leave these untrained sisters alone with gravely ill patients and the house not yet in order. I have hired a night nurse. After a few days, the sisters will do admirably, thank God. And a day later, I wrote, I know you would stay 2 days longer if you were here. Well, I stayed in Columbus until the hospital could be dedicated. Finally, Monsignor Speck came to officiate at the dedication of this new hospital to Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Well, I returned home by the end of July 1886 when we were finally ready to lay the foundation for the convent church of Our Lady of Loretto, and I had many details to finalize. Our beloved Sister Leoba was painting the Stations of the Cross. The painted windows were being done by the Carmelite nuns in France. And the rose window over the portal had been commissioned by my mother in memory of my brother Neil. Well, with the church completed, I took to my bed in weariness in the new year, and I laid my burden down March 4th, 1887. I was 63 years old.
Bishop Gilmore of Cleveland shared these thoughts during the homily at Sister Angela's funeral. How many are there among us here today whom she has molded, attracted, inspired with high and religious ambition? It is difficult for those who have not known her to realize the extent of her labors. Not everyone can comprehend the depth of Mother Angela's devotion to the cause of God. Many have seen it, but few understood it. For many a long, long day, this community will feel the gap made by Mother Angela's loss. May she rest in peace.
Mother Angela helped build 39 institutions. Her efforts at Mount Carmel bore fruit. The center flourished, and in 2023, it had 4 hospitals in the Columbus, Ohio area, with over 10,000 employees, 2,000 physicians, and over 900 volunteers, serving over 1 million patients.
May my soul desire thee. May it seek thee. May it find thee. May it retain thee. Be thou the most cherished object of my affections, the continual subject of my thoughts and meditations. May I seek thy glory in all things by humility, prudence, and discretion, with love and joy, with perseverance to the end.